Hi everybody, good to be back. Sorry I've been gone. I've been dealing with a literal trifecta of just crap. Literally could not talk for a little bit. But I'm good now. I'm all totally fine again and back up and at it. So over that time I was doing some research and reading up on different things and kind of, I wanted to talk about the Mercy Brown case. And for those of you who don't know what the Mercy Brown case is, it was a case of suspected vampirism that happened in 1892. What I didn't realize is that this would be so much bigger than I thought it would be. Like, have you guys ever kind of had this thing where you thought something was one thing and you look into it and it feels like it just kind of keeps spiraling down ever further, ever deeper, way more than you ever thought would become of that particular thing? Well, if you know what I'm talking about, then that's exactly what happened this past week or so with this Mercy Brown case. What I thought was going to be an isolated case of vampirism in relatively modern times became an entire epidemic of people suspecting dead relatives of being vampires. I had no idea prior to this that this country that I've lived in my entire life, that I've gone to school in, that I've studied history as a part of for over 12 years, had a century-long New England vampire panic. So that's what I'm going to talk to you guys all about today. And I hope you'll find it as interesting and fascinating as I did. So I'm going to begin talking about this New England vampire panic with the Mercy Brown case, because for one thing, it's a good kind of summary overview. It's the most popular case, but even though it's the end of the panic, for me, it was kind of the beginning of this whole discovery. So that's where I'd like to start. Now, Mercy Brown was a teenager who lived in the late 1800s in a small town called Exeter, Rhode Island. This was really a very rural farming community. She had a somewhat large family. She sewed, she cooked, it was a farming family, farming town. So all was well until she was a teenager, and then all of a sudden her mother got ill and died of tuberculosis. Now, tuberculosis was a disease that was commonly referred to at the time as consumption, because it literally appears to consume the person it attacks. Shortly after Mercy's mother died, her older sister fell ill and died as well. It took a few years, but eventually Mercy became very ill and died of tuberculosis. The case really kind of starts from there. At this time, Mercy's father was faced with really an impossible situation. His entire family was dying off before his eyes, and his son was now deathly ill with the same disease that took his 2 daughters and his wife. And there was literally nothing he could do about it, because tuberculosis had no cure. The bacteria that causes the disease was barely known. It was only discovered a decade previously, and a cure for the disease would not become available until the 1940s. So families who were put in this position literally had no options. But panic was very prominent because if this yet unknown, and to the rural communities it very likely was still unknown, even though the actual disease had been discovered a decade before. This unknown disease could kill off entire families. What was to stop it from spreading to the rest of the town? So neighbors from the town went to the father and requested that he let the women of his family be exhumed and examined for vampirism. Now Mercy's father, did not believe in vampires. It's been reported that he did not believe, but he eventually allowed it to happen. His wife and his 2 daughters were exhumed. His elder daughter and his wife were considerably decomposed at this time, as they had been buried for quite a few years, but Mercy was still relatively intact. We know that that's because she hadn't been dead for more than a few months at this time, and it was winter, so her body was fairly well preserved because of those 2 things there. But with no better answers, and having found blood in her heart and lungs, the townsfolk declared her a vampire and declared that she was sucking the life out of her brother. So, as a cure for that, they took Mercy's heart and lungs out of her body, burned them, and fed the ashes to her ailing brother as hopefully a cure and to return the life force that Mercy had supposedly sucked out of him. Shocker, it didn't work, and the brother ended up dying 2 months later anyhow. That essentially is the story of Mercy Brown, the last of the recorded incidences of supposed vampirism in Rhode Island and the surrounding areas. The question, though, remains, why did this happen? Why was vampirism even a possibility in a time that had already seen the Industrial Revolution a century before, had seen the end of the Salem witch trials, and essentially the conclusion that witches, vampires, supernatural didn't exist with that ending in the 2 centuries before Mercy's death? How did this still happen in a supposed modern and enlightened era? Well, to get there, I'm going to talk first a little bit about some of the timeline of the events. Normally, I don't really focus on dates, but I feel like in this case, it does help to bring a lot of perspective to that. Second, we should talk about the nature of tuberculosis and the desperation that a lot of people felt around that. And thirdly, some of the public opinions and understanding about diseases and superstition at this time. And I feel like if we discuss those 3 key points, the rest will kind of fall into place, and the answer to that question will just kind of emerge. So first, a quick timeline of events. 1693 saw the Salem witch trials. The vampire panic started in 1790. The Industrial Revolution also began in that same time period, 1790s. So, to recap that, the New England vampire panic and the Industrial Revolution kind of started at the same time, not the Stone Age, okay? civilization was definitely on its way of modernizing when the New England vampire panic started. The migration west via railroads and for the gold rush really started to see its effects take root in about 1840. That's when you could really see the effects on the east happening as many able-bodied men were moving out west. Civil War ended in 1865. At this time, the New England vampire panic is still in full swing. The bacteria for tuberculosis, the cause of tuberculosis, was definitively proven and discovered in 1882. And the New England vampire panic only ended with Mercy Brown's case in 1892. So that's really a timeline, a quick timeline of the events of the New England vampire panic and that were surrounding it. As you can see, this was not a time that was ruled by superstition and, it wasn't the medieval times. Industrialization was happening. The move out west was happening. The Civil War was happening. All this stuff was happening. Modernization in medicines and medical knowledge was rapidly progressing at this time, yet superstition continued to rule in this instance. Okay, so what was tuberculosis exactly? Well, as I've said before, but really feel the need to reiterate, TB at this time was a death sentence, and actually was a death sentence up until even the 1940s. So well past the end of this vampire epidemic. To put it into perspective, it can really kind of be somewhat compared to the fear generated from the AIDS epidemic, and maybe not quite as prolific, but even the desperation felt by the Black Plague. Literally, if you were diagnosed with TB in the 17 and 1800s up until the 1940s, you were going to die. You had an 80% chance of dying. Not only that, this disease was contagious and had the ability to wipe out entire families. Now, this was before the construction of all the sanatoriums that went up across the United States after the bacteria had been discovered and quarantining patients became a necessity. So not only was this disease hopeless for those who ended up contracting it, it was awful to watch a loved one dying from this disease. Some of the telltale markers of tuberculosis are a heavy, sometimes bloody cough, high fevers, pain, and a sinking appearance, a literal sinking appearance of the chest as the bacteria ravages the lungs so completely. Now, that same sinking chest was exactly why the idea of a vampire came into play in the first place. I think as demonstrated by the Mercy Brown, it probably seems pretty clear that they did not think of vampires as we have come to know vampires, as like the blood-sucking demons of the night, or there's lots of different options now that you can partake in, but they didn't see it as any of that. It was essentially just a corpse leeching out life from living victims without any actual like blood-sucking Walking Dead type superstitious there. With that, I think we can kind of transition right over into the public opinions at the time, which is the third point that I wanted to discuss in order to answer the overreaching question of why. So the very curious thing about the New England vampire panic in general is that most people involved in the exhumations did not actually believe in vampires. This is kind of demonstrated by the Mercy Brown case, in the sense of Mercy's father. He did not actually believe in the vampire superstitions, but still allowed his family members to be exhumed and for Mercy's organs to be burned. Why? Well, that's really this kind of sad thing about this whole circumstance. Even though people didn't really believe, they didn't have any other options. And it essentially goes to the idea of believing in something is better than believing in nothing at all. And that really is kind of the crux of the entire New England vampire panic and the answer to why it happened. It comes down to a very sad case of hopelessness and desperation. Wanting to keep your family alive, not having any idea how to do that, and knowing that if you don't try something, you'll be doing nothing. It's kind of that thought that wouldn't you do just about anything if you think you could save a loved one's life? And that's really all it comes down to, is if you have no other hope, and these people didn't, and there's no real answers, why not try something crazy? So, in a kind of convoluted, interesting sense, the original vampires were not so much a beacon of fear, but more of a beacon of hope for those people who had none. Hopeless people getting hope anywhere they can, and in this case, through vampires. That is essentially a summary of the New England vampire panic. So I'll leave you guys with that today. That new light on vampires and the meaning of what they can be to people. That's all I have for you guys today. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet and would like to, please feel free to do that and set your notifications. That way you can be informed when I post new videos. I try and get videos up as often as I can. These last couple weeks have been a little slow, but I will try and get back on a weekly schedule. So I hope you guys all have a wonderful evening, wonderful week. I'll see you guys all very soon. So, bye everybody.